So it's been about a year and a half since I last posted on YouTube, and I wanted to explain where I've been. Around the time I stopped posting, I decided to take everything I'd learned from getting fluent myself, traveling across Spain, Colombia and Peru, working with my clients, and write it all into one book. One complete plan from going from scratch to conversationally fluent in 6 months on 4 hours of sit-down study a week, plus a few daily habits. And then because I didn't want to publish something I hadn't stress tested myself, I ran the entire plan again on myself with Portuguese, starting from zero to make sure it actually worked. That entire process of writing the book, coaching my clients, learning Portuguese, and then updating the plan again is what took me away from YouTube for so long. And I call this plan the Spanish Flywheel, and I'll get into the name later on, but I hope it's the ultimate guide to conversational fluency for those of us who are very busy. And it involves 3 jumps: beginner to elementary, elementary to intermediate, and then intermediate to conversational fluency. And each jump has its own defined structure, and the plan totals 26 weeks, and I'll walk you through exactly what to study and which habits to build for each one of those jumps. But before we get there, there's a couple of things we need to iron out first to make sure you approach this plan in the right way. So the first question I want to ask you is, why are you learning Spanish? I don't want you to think that this plan is a complete shortcut, because frankly there are none learning Spanish. This is just a very streamlined plan to get you there as fast as possible. So before you start, get clear on your why, and it doesn't need to be a deep or profound reason. Maybe you just think Spanish is cool or want to use it for the odd holiday. That is perfectly fine, but just make sure you flesh that out. What does it actually look like to you? And then from there you can decide whether the end goal is worth the work that this plan requires. Now that you've clearly defined your why, we need to understand the fundamental problem behind people learning Spanish and why so many people who want to reach fluency never get there. So, what is the problem? In my eyes, when you strip back all of the different styles and approaches to learning Spanish that you see online, they all have the same fundamental flaw. And that is that they treat Spanish as a hobby, an extra thing to develop gradually alongside your work, social life and family commitments. It's an added stressor to your day, an extra thing on the to-do list that you must make time for. And although this seems like the only reasonable approach for those who lead a busy life, it is the path to little progress and unfortunately a lot of wasted time. So you might be asking, what is the alternative if you're busy? How can Spanish be anything else other than a hobby? And this is ultimately where my USP kicks in, and the thing that I was trying to flesh out over the last year and a half is that Spanish must be a part of your daily life for this plan to work. We need to create a level of immersion that keeps Spanish in the forefront of your mind, where your mind begins to see the world around you in Spanish. And this entire concept can be really nicely distilled down by a quote from my favorite author, Haruki Murakami, that says, "Learning another language is like becoming another person." If you think about it, the entire world around you is filtered through your language. Every object, emotion, experience is all filtered through words. Even your thoughts themselves are in your native tongue. And what we want to do is leverage this by building the habit of switching this language from your native tongue to Spanish. And this constant interaction with Spanish is what makes the time frame of 6 months totally doable, because you're not just engaging with the language for one short period a day as if it was a hobby. Instead, it begins to filter into your everyday experience as you're constantly turning over concepts, words, and phrases in your mind that make your progress so much faster. Now, I could spend hours talking about this subject because I literally spent months writing about it, but if there's one thing I want you to take away from this video, it is the idea that Spanish should not be a hobby. It should be something that you integrate into your daily life. And once you make this switch, language learning becomes pretty easy in my eyes. Now, the final thing to iron out before giving you the Spanish flywheel is answering, where do you want to learn Spanish from? Spanish is so varied across countries and even across regions that you must be specific. The example I've always given to my students is that there's over 20 ways to say cool in Spanish. So if you didn't know exactly which region you wanted to learn from, you could waste your time learning 20 different ways to say the same thing. And now imagine doing this across hundreds of words, if not thousands. And this is what makes Spanish impossible to learn. When you're conversationally fluent in one dialect, you can branch out with more confidence and faster because you have that base understanding. But right now, I need you to pick one region. And now we can start to break down the actual system. As I said before, there's 3 parts of the Spanish flywheel: 4 hours of specific study, immersion through a series of Spanish habits, and having the right mindset, which will dedicate other videos to properly breaking down. But for now, all I want you to remember is that you must treat Spanish as part of your daily life. It can no longer just be a hobby. And as I said, I spent a year writing this plan into a 150-page book, so there's no way I can package everything into a single video. I'm going to unfortunately skip a lot of the nuances, but hopefully by giving you the bare bones framework, you can at least take it away and start making strong progress towards your goals of fluency. Then you guys can let me know in the comments what parts you want me to explain in further detail in future videos. And if you are interested in working with me directly to speed up your journey towards fluency, you can check the top link in the description, and I also have a totally free newsletter. There'll be a link in the description to that as well. So jump 1 is A1 to A2, which is just beginner to elementary, and we've given 10 weeks to achieve that. Jump 2 is A2 to B1, so elementary to intermediate, which we've also given 10 weeks to achieve. And then jump 3 is B1 to B2, which is intermediate to conversational fluency. Our goal to achieve that is 6 weeks. And I know some people are going to hear jump 3 going from B1 to B2 in 6 weeks, and they're going to turn their nose up at it, they're going to leave some comments, and that is totally fair enough. But I just ask that you watch this video in full and understand the framework that we are building out across the entire 26 weeks, as to understand why I genuinely believe that you can make really, really fast progress when you hit that jump 3 based on all the work, systems and habits that you built up across those first 20 weeks. And yeah, we'll get into all of that later. So this plan starts with a prep week, aka a week 0. And I think it's always best to start these plans on a Monday. So I basically give my clients until the following Monday to sort themselves out, digest the plan, answer the question as to where they want to learn Spanish from, and also why they want to learn Spanish. And the final thing I also ask them to do is buy a grammar resource. And this is something that I think is absolutely essential for language learning. And when you're buying this grammar resource, I want you to be specific to your country if possible, because then they're using the language that you're going to repeatedly hear. And I've left a link to the best one for Spain Spanish because it's the one that really helped me. And yes, this might be a little expensive, but if you are serious about learning Spanish, it's a great time-saving investment because you will have one direct source for all of your grammar needs from beginner right up to conversational fluency. And it's something that we're going to use throughout the entire plan. And it's much better than the alternative of binge watching grammar videos without actually applying it with practice questions. And once you've done that, I'd recommend using the rest of the week to look at where you can find the time for the 4 hours of study and the immersive habits. The 4 hours are simple enough. Ideally, we don't want them to be all in one go. The best case scenario is that you have 1 hour chunks across your week. So 4 days, you have 1 hour of Spanish. And then integrating the immersive habits is something that we'll get into later after you understand what they are. And I'll give you some tips around that as well. So now let's start to break down jump 1. And unfortunately for you beginners, jump 1 is the least fun block. However, that is the nature of being a beginner at something. It's always going to be hardest and least enjoyable at the beginning. As we said, jump 1 is a 10-week chunk and it's split into 2 blocks, the first 6 weeks and the remaining 4 weeks. And for the 4 hours of study, what you have for the first 6 weeks is 2 hours of grammar where you just go through your textbook, an hour and 30 minutes of working through vocab and learning the essential vocab through patterns, and then 30 minutes of speaking/pronunciation work. And the main focus here is getting you up to speed on the foundations as fast as possible through patterns. And throughout the 10 weeks, we'll solidify those patterns through the immersive habits. And for learning vocab, the Madrigal's Magic Key to Spanish book lays this out perfectly. It states the funny premise that you actually already know thousands of words in Spanish because they are so similar to English. All you need to do is understand a couple of patterns. And some words can be doctor, hospital, popular, dramático, presidente, invitación. These are all words you can understand immediately. All you need to do is recognize the pattern and build up a bank of hearing these words. And you can find these patterns all over the internet now, so there's no need to buy that book. And in terms of how to break down the hour and a half of vocab practice, I'd recommend doing 3 blocks of 30-minute chunks. And essentially what you do is for each 30-minute chunk, you have 10 minutes writing up new vocab, 10 minutes going through it, and then 10 minutes reviewing the previous block of words you went through in the previous session. So obviously for the first session, you won't have to do that. But for the first week, there's something particular I want you to do with this hour and a half, and that is write out and learn the essential greetings from your region. From then, week 2 onwards, you can start learning the essential vocab. What this does is it immediately gives you a leg up into that language and into that region by understanding some greetings that you can immediately use to feel like you've got a grasp of that language. And one nuance that I did want to mention from the book that I think is super important for this early stage in getting you through it is the underlying principle that 20% of Spanish, roughly 2,000 words, make up 80% of the daily language used. So if you can get your head around the essential 20% of Spanish, then you can understand 80% of spoken Spanish. And I know 2,000 words sounds like a lot, but when you already know a good chunk of them through patterns, it makes life a lot easier. And then through that repeated immersive habits, you will build up a bank of understanding these words. And then in terms of the half an hour of speaking/pronunciation practice, the very first thing that you can do is search up online all of the pronunciation rules for pronouncing words in Spanish, given your country. And then from there, make a note of those. And for the following time that you have, you can just listen to Spanish videos and try and shadow the person that is speaking. And I know this might be awkward at first and something that is very easy to put off, and you can spend an extra half an hour doing grammar practice, but I'm telling you, this is super important because at the end of the day, you're here to learn to speak Spanish. So you need to be practicing that skill from day one, even when you only know a couple of greetings. Because I know so many people who are very, very intelligent with Spanish, but stopped building up that skill of speaking. And then what you have is this massive gap between the level of knowledge that they have and the ability that they have to speak. And that gap never actually gets bridged. And therefore you have these people who are very, very intelligent, who never actually are conversationally fluent. And that's the last thing you want to get to. So make sure you practice that speaking from day one. Then remember I said for jump 1, that plan is only for the first 6 weeks. And then for the final 4 weeks, what you want to do is swap the hour and a half of vocab revision for just an hour and spend 30 minutes having written conversations with AI. And the reason for doing this is because it gears you up for speaking, because what it does is it lays the foundations and builds the connections mentally for you to form sentences and actually start creating in Spanish. And this will make it a much smoother transition to actually speaking and forming sentences yourself. And all you need to do for this is just have a simple prompt for Claude or ChatGPT or whatever your favorite AI is. Tell it the topic of conversation, say that you're a beginner and you want to have a very basic conversation using basic vocab. And then at the end of the session, ask for detailed feedback on next steps to improve your Spanish and also understand the gaps in your knowledge. And then from there, you can use that as the foundation as to what words and vocab you want to learn and also the grammar concepts you might want to develop on. And this is the first step of Spanish becoming fun, where you're able to start producing in that language and using all of the hard work and knowledge that you've built up over the first 6 weeks. So this is something to look forward to. And now that we've covered the 4 hours of study for both the 6 and 4 week blocks of Jump 1, now we can turn our attention to the habits. And the habits themselves don't really change throughout this entire 6-month framework. They just get harder and closer to native level Spanish as you yourself get better at Spanish. And for Jump 1, the 2 absolute essential habits that form the base of our system are listening to beginner podcasts and repeated exposure to the essential vocab throughout the week. And the key here that I said we would look into is integrating these 2 habits into your daily life, because we do need to do quite a lot of these 2 habits in order to build up that foundation very quickly. So when it comes to listening to these beginner Spanish podcasts, we want you to be doing this anytime you're traveling to and from work, the gym, socializing. Any type of commute is an absolutely great time to listen to these Spanish podcasts and start to build up that foundation. And I'm sorry if you're a music lover like me, but this is a sacrifice that we have to make, because what we need is for your brain to become accustomed to hearing Spanish regularly, and this is the best way that we can do that. Can you also listen whilst you're cooking, taking the dog for a walk, or any other little habits you have where you can just fill Spanish into that gap? Because what you'll find from my videos and my content is that listening is absolutely fundamental to developing your understanding of Spanish. So the more that you can build that immersion up throughout the week, the more impactful it's going to be on your Spanish learning journeys. Now, in terms of listening resources, the Easy Spanish YouTube channel is the best for beginners because they conduct real-life Spanish interviews and have both subtitles in English and Spanish. But when it comes to podcasts, it's really up to you to explore depending on your region. But start off by searching up beginner podcasts and see which hosts or topics you enjoy to listen to. This is where you have a bit of flexibility because, again, it needs to be something that you can find some enjoyment in. Otherwise, it's going to be very hard to switch out the English podcast or music you normally listen to for Spanish. Now, with the other habit of practicing those essential phrases, a good way to do this is by tagging it onto existing habits that you already have. This is called habit anchoring. So for example, immediately after you get home from work, you do 5 minutes, or before you watch TV, you do 5 minutes, or before bed, a shower, walking the dog, do 5 minutes of vocab practice. I'd also recommend for when you're out and about on public transport, when you have a minute to check your phone, downloading the free app Quizlet. It's basically a free online flashcard app where you can just search up for essential vocab and slang from different regions. And it's basically a way for you to practice these words whilst you're on the go instead of needing to have that piece of paper or those flashcards that you're using. And please, whatever you do, don't swap anything for Duolingo. I'll get into that in future videos. And I know I'm recommending a hell of a lot of vocab revision for that first jump, but I can't understate its importance for forming the foundation of your Spanish that will then help you kick on in jumps 2 and 3 and reach conversational fluency. And then in terms of numerical goals for these habits, I'd recommend between 6 to 10 hours of listening a week. And then if you can try and get 3 to 4 practice sessions of vocab revision in each day, that would be great. And I know some people might hear 6 to 10 hours a week of listening is quite intense, but if you have a commute to and from work that is an hour, you already have 10 hours in the bag of listening that you can do, because obviously an hour to and from work 5 days a week. So it's really not that difficult when you start to expand it across an entire week and start finding little bits where you can plug in that Spanish listening. And now I'm going to just give you some other little habits that are worth building in the long run. But again, you can pick and choose which ones work best for you in your schedule. But the more of these you incorporate, the faster you're going to reach fluency. The first one is anything that you consume, can you find the Spanish equivalent and watch it with English subtitles? Or if you're going to watch an English piece of content, at least watch it with Spanish subtitles. The second one is anything that you have to write, do it in Spanish, whether that's shopping lists, making a note of something, to-do lists. Number 3, Spanishify your social medias. Try to direct your feeds towards Spanish content by following educational accounts, people who do live street interviews. This is such a simple way for when you're relaxing to still have Spanish entering your brain. And finally, downloading an online dictionary to your phone to make it as frictionless as possible to access. Ideally, you want it to be 2-3 clicks away so that whenever you have a word that you're hearing in the podcast or that you're constantly coming across but don't know the answer to, you can search up that word and immediately get the answer. Now, I know I've just given a hell of a lot of information, so please do take time to digest this video, make notes of what you think, and please do let me know in the comments if there's any things that you want clarification on. Now we can move on to jump 2, which is going from elementary to intermediate in 10 weeks. And the 4 hours of study are as follows. 1 hour of grammar, just continuing to go through that textbook. 40 minutes of actively practicing verb conjugations. Now this will hopefully be covered in your grammar textbook and you may have already started to look into this, but it's important to set aside 2 20-minute chunks a week to sit down and put these conjugations to memory. And you can follow the format that your grammar book offers you or just look up online the best order to learn the Spanish tenses. And how I would break down each of those 20-minute chunks is do a 5-minute review of the previous week's conjugations and then 15 minutes practicing the new ones to make sure that you're still solidifying what you went over in the previous session. And the next thing is 1 hour of vocab practice. So this remains from jump 1, and this can be broken down into 2 chunks of 30 minutes where you have 10 minutes discovering new words, 10 minutes revising the new vocab, and then 10 minutes reviewing the essential vocab from jump 1, because we need to make sure that you're still revisiting those essential foundations. And now things can get a little bit more fun on this side because you can start tailoring your vocab towards topics that actually interest you. And another thing I'd recommend you to do at this stage is start to look at more of the essential set phrases that are going to help you really build out your speaking in Spanish. So things such as desde mi punto de vista, diría que, these kind of set phrases that are going to be very good to fall back on when you're having conversations. And the next thing is 20 minutes of written AI conversation. So again, this continues off the back of the end of jump 1. And now you can prompt to have different conversations in different tenses as well, because as you get better at those conjugations, you can now start to have conversations in the past, present and future. And then the final hour for the 4 hours of studying in jump 2 is 1 hour conversations with AI. And don't worry, this is not all in one go. I'd recommend doing 4 sessions of 15 minutes, or you can break them down into 10-minute sessions. And similar to what we said before, you want to prompt AI into saying that you're at a basic level of Spanish and are trying to develop the ability to speak. You're going to start off with a monologue, so you're going to try and explain what you've done that day or what your plans are for that day if you're recording in the morning. And then after that, you want to make sure that you say, don't interrupt me until I say in English, I am done. Because what sometimes AI will do is when you're having conversations, if you pause, it will immediately jump in thinking that you've finished your thought. So make sure that you say, don't stop me until I have said, I am done in English. And then from there, it allows you to pause and have those freeze moments. And then once you're done, you can then say, I am done in English. So what you then want to do is once you've finished up saying everything that you could, then ask AI to have a very basic conversation with you based on what you've said. If it can then pull apart different points to talk about or very basic conversation points that you can then have to then develop your own ability to speak. But again, keep it all in speech. And there are settings on AI now that you can have just conversations with. So find that with ChatGPT and Claude and whatever AI that you're using. Then, as I said before, make sure at the end of the conversation you get written feedback from AI. So it gives you the vocab that maybe you're missing or some grammar mistakes that you kept making or some basic words you might need to go back and review. These kinds of things are going to be very, very helpful to really build out your foundation and make sure there's no blind spots in your Spanish as you're getting towards that intermediate level. So make sure you always ask for that feedback. And then also as well, if you do catch yourself getting caught speaking and missing words, pause and go search them up on your online dictionary and then make a note of them in your revision vocab so you can go back to them in your habits and also in your hour of vocab revision each week. And now that we've covered the 4 hours of central study for the entirety of jump 2, we can now look at the habits. And realistically, the habits don't really change much. There's just one nuance from my book that I want to make sure I bring across that I think is super important. Because now what will be happening is as you get into jump 2, the beginner podcast will hopefully be getting a little too easy for you. And this is how you can recognize when to move on. You always want the podcast to be slightly above your level. It's a fundamental learning theory called the I+1 principle. And this is basically where we can leverage a term called comprehensible input, which is basically when you understand the bulk of what's being said in the conversation, but there are a couple of words or a couple of phrases throughout that you don't really understand. But just by understanding the general conversation and the general tone of what's being said, you can kind of make a guess at what those words are going to be. And over time, through that repeated process, you then start to build up a massive bank of vocabulary. And this is something that we can start to leverage from jump 2 as the beginner podcasts start to become a bit easier. And now that jump 2 is done, we can turn our attention to the final jump. Now, people normally call jump 3 the hardest in Spanish. You hear a lot of people online talk about the intermediate plateau, but in my eyes, that plateau happens to people who've been treating Spanish as a hobby and not making it part of their life. But if you've been following this plan, you spent the last 20 weeks building that habit of weaving Spanish into your daily life. So that flywheel that I mentioned earlier, and is the name of this plan, the Spanish flywheel, is hopefully spinning at full speed by the time you get to jump 3. That's why 6 weeks is enough to go from intermediate to conversational fluency, because throughout this 26-week plan, the rate at which you're improving in Spanish is increasing. Now, the 4 hours of studying is now largely focused on speaking. As you can maybe see, the trend is the longer this plan goes on, the more we focus on outputs, aka producing in Spanish. And there are 2 types of conversation that you're going to have in jump 3. The first of which is that same conversations that we had with AI, but you're not going to do the monologue at the start. You're just going to go straight into having a talk about a particular topic. And the second type of conversation is a solo conversation. And this again is another 30 minutes of your 4 hours of studying. And ideally you want to break this off into 5-minute sections. So you do 5 minutes at the end of every day, 6 days a week, where you just talk about what you've gone through that day. And ideally you record this and then you can listen back to it maybe when you're commuting to and from work or immediately after you finished. Because what you're going to do is the fact that you've spent now so much time listening to podcasts, you're going to develop a native ear, you're going to develop an understanding of what it likes to hear proper Spanish. And then what you're going to do is when you listen back to what you've said, you're going to start to pick up on some of the discrepancies between the level of Spanish that you're at and how natives speak and how natives express themselves. So having that process of explaining things and recording it and then listening back to it is just going to help you recognize some of the gaps that you have naturally and again start making progress towards that native level of Spanish. And just remember, with those AI conversations, you're still going to ask for feedback to make sure that you keep building out your vocab and your understanding and maybe the holes you have to still plug when it comes to reaching conversational fluency. Now, the next thing you can do with your 4 hours of study is 1 hour of what I call consolidation. And this is totally free for you to decide how you want to use that hour. But essentially what I want you to think about is where is the biggest gap or where is the biggest thing holding you back from reaching conversational fluency, and work on that for an hour a week. And how to decide on this is you can use the conversations that you're having with AI and the feedback that it gives you. You can think about when you're listening back to yourself and hearing where those discrepancies are, or even when you're speaking yourself, are you recognizing that you need to build up a better bank of set phrases to fall back on when you're speaking, or is there a certain grammar concept that's really holding you back that you need to work on? These are all the things you can look at when it comes to that hour of consolidation. Now, the next thing I want you to do for this 4 hours of studying is dedicating an hour a week to that grammar resource that we touched on earlier. And this has been a constant theme throughout this book because grammar is obviously so fundamental to the way that you speak and communicate within a language. And now what I hopefully want you to be working towards is the subjunctive. It is, in my eyes, the hardest grammatical concept in Spanish. And it's something that really helps you bridge the gap from going from intermediate to conversational fluency. And I do have my own subjunctive deep dive course, so if you want me to put that out there, let me know in the comments. And the next thing you're going to do is those 30 minutes of phrase and vocab revision. Again, this is something that's been a constant theme throughout this plan, and I'm not going to go through this in any more detail. I think you've heard enough of me rambling on about it. The next thing is 30 minutes of conjugation practice. So again, it's similar to jump 2. We want you to keep nailing those conjugations because it's something that's really going to help you speak with more fluency. And now that we touched on the 4 hours of study, for jump 3, we can look at the habits. And realistically, the habits don't change much. The only thing that you can maybe try and do is start to aim more towards those native level podcasts. They're just normal podcasts for Hispanic audiences to consume. That is when you know you're really getting towards that conversational fluency level. But aside from that, just keep going with those habits and keep trying to up the difficulty. And then by the end of this plan, you should be conversationally fluent. And if for whatever reason you don't feel you've reached that level yet, by the end of the 26 weeks, you can just continue to follow the jump 3 plan until you get there. Then, once you've achieved conversational fluency, you can drop off all of the studying elements and just listen to Spanish throughout the week and keep up your 5 to 10 minutes of speaking 4 to 5 days a week, and your level will keep improving beyond a basic conversational fluency. And that is it. I hope you found this video helpful because it's been over a year in the making and has gone through so many edits and tests before finally being published. And I've literally sat here for nearly 3 hours recording this video to try and make sure I explain it as well as possible. So yeah, I hope you found it helpful. And if you are interested in taking this a step further and working with me directly, check the top link in the description. And otherwise, feel free to subscribe to my newsletter for more info. It's totally free. And please drop me a comment as to what you want to see in the next video. Thanks for watching. Hasta la próxima.